Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second online meetup of Full Stack Developers Israel by Tikal. My name is Anat and I'm the community manager of Full Stack Developers Israel. Today we have a very special guest with us, Darren Murph. He's head of remote at GitLab, the world's largest all-remote company. Before I head the virtual mic over to Darren, we'll hear a few words from Lior Kanfi, who's the founder and CEO of Tikal Knowledge. Before we start, I just want to let you know that this session is broadcasted live on our YouTube channel, and we're also recording it, so you can watch it later as well. You can ask questions on the YouTube channel if you want, and we'll answer a few of them after Darren's talk. And then we have a private Q&A session, which will not be broadcasted. So I'm handing over the mic to Lior now for his talk.
Yeah, thank you. Just a second, I will share my screen. Okay, you can see my screen on it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good evening. My name is Lior from Tikal, and welcome to the GitLab Remote Playbook Meetup with Darren Murph. Thank you, Darren, for joining us. The Full Stack community is the largest meetup in Israel with more than 12,000 members who meets on a monthly basis for almost 8 years. And today I would like to introduce to you the Full Stack Tech Radar, which is enable us, our community members, software leaders, and organizations to stay ahead of the game in the software industry. The Tech Radar is built from 4 domains: backend and machine learning, DevOps, front-end, and mobile, and has 4 rings. The tri-ring represents tech topics to explore and pay attention to. The start ring represents tech topics to start using development environment with caution in production. The keep ring represents tech topics which are current best breed of any software technology stack. And the stop ring represents tech topics which should avoid using and are current technical debt. In addition, the Tech Radar summarizes the hottest trends in the software industry. The AI ops, machine learning is changing the way that we develop our product, but it also changes the way that our development production environment and how do we use them as developers. Microservices aftershock. The rise of microservices architecture usage impacts the structure we build software teams, usage of multi-programming languages and other domains, such as front-end, for instance, micro front-end approach. And the polycloud strategy, a new approach to choose the best of breed of cloud managed services and not committing to locked in to one cloud vendor. And finally, the remote work, definitely the most popular topics nowadays, but already been marked and noticed by us in late 2019 as the new approach to the local software talent shortage. And here's the opportunity for us to hear about remote work from the earliest adopters, GitLab, the world's largest all-remote company with more than 1,700 employees in all over 65 countries. So go ahead, Darren, that's your stage. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lior. And thanks everyone for joining today. I'm going to share a presentation, but first I want to say to those joining on Zoom, we're going to do a very GitLab-y thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I want to invite you to actually participate in this. So I'm going to send out a link here. You should see that. So that's a Google Doc. So one of the things that I'll invite you to do during this call is something that GitLab does, which is for every business meeting we have, we append a Google Doc in the invite. And that serves as the permanent agenda so that you can even look back at past meetings, click on one link, and get some takeaways on what happened in that meeting. And so for today, so that we don't have any knowledge leaks, we've also appended a Google Doc to this meeting. You'll see up top, I've given you some kind of pre-reads, some important links that I think will be useful. You can read those afterwards. And then there's some questions down below. Now I see that some folks have already put a few questions in, which is awesome. And as we were getting started here, I actually went through some of these and added a few links and a few answers, and I'll explain that as well as we go. But I think we're down to questions 7 or 8 now. So as I'm going, if things pop to your mind, feel free to add questions there and we'll address those after the fact. So with that, let's jump over to the deck. Awesome. So thank you all very, very much for being gracious with your time. Thanks for joining today. We're in an interesting place in the world, and remote work is now a very germane topic for a lot of people. They were working co-located a month ago, and now they find themselves suddenly remote. And so this deck focuses mostly on what teams and leaders can do to stabilize their environments and help their teams thrive. But I want to encourage you to add questions from the individual perspective as well. And one of the guys that I linked in that document in Zoom actually speaks to what are the top things that individuals can do in their own homes if they've been forced into work from home right now to better acclimate to that. So I invite questions from that perspective as well. So a bit about me. I've been working remotely across the spectrum of remote for my entire career, so over 14 years now. So I've worked in co-located spaces. I've worked in hybrid remote settings where part of the company is in an office and part of the company is remote and distributed around the globe. And now at GitLab, the world's largest all-remote company where we have no company-owned offices whatsoever. So even the executives work remote, and we've been that way from the start. So if you want to have a meeting with our CEO, you'll need to come to his apartment, or once the world returns back to normal, arrange a time to meet at a coffee shop. And the first 3 employees of the company were actually in 3 different countries. And so they were kind of remote by default. They briefly had an office after graduating from Y Combinator. It was just the thing to do. That lasted about 3 days. And then people stopped showing up and they said, well, why should we waste money on this lease? Work is still getting done. We're still communicating with each other. And thus the all remote notion of GitLab was born. I want to preface what I'm going to speak about today with this. So a couple of weeks ago, a lot of our best knowledge, a lot of the guides that I've published within the GitLab handbook, we packaged together in something that we're calling the remote playbook. And so if you go to allremote.info, which I'll share in the Google Doc that I linked, you'll see right at the top the ability to download this. And this packages up our best knowledge in one nicely designed PDF ebook, something that you can forward around and share as you go. But just if you miss anything today, don't worry, it's all available online. So we believe that all remote is the future of work. When you decouple geography and work, you empower a lot of amazing things to happen. But it does have its challenges, and especially when external forces like the ones that we're dealing with today rush its implementation. So I want to say that there's a big difference between forced work from home in a crisis and a very intentionally structured remote work environment. 2 different things. So a lot of people are getting their first real taste of remote work and working from home in mass. And I just want to say that this is not typical. It's not normal. Even at GitLab, where we're all remote already, things still feel a little bit weird. You can tell that it's not quite dialed in, and there are external forces that are impacting this. And so if you're a little bit upset with how work from home is going for you, I assure you that you're not alone, but this is an opportunity to dial in some infrastructure and get a few things right to lay the groundwork for what's ahead. 3 main challenges that I'm going to address today. The first is workspace. What if your home isn't designed to be an office? The second is communications. A common thought there is we never thought about structuring our communications. It's something that just happened, and now with no one in the same office, it's a very urgent need. And the last thing, and I think the most important thing, is mindset. And you have to put yourself in a mindset of we need to break all the rules, and it's going to seem awkward until it doesn't. And I just want to get you in the right mindset, speaking of, that transferring and transitioning to remote is not something that happens overnight. I've seen a lot of team leaders kind of hard on themselves that it's not quite working out the way they thought overnight. And I just want to encourage you that remote isn't something that happens overnight. It's not a binary switch that you flip. It is very much a journey of iteration. So we're going to talk about how to begin that journey and actually put yourself in the right mindset to go from phase 1 to phase 2 and beyond. So 5 things right now that you as a team leader can focus on to maximize stability. So the key thing right now, if you've been forced into remote, is to focus on stability. We just need to stabilize things, but in that stabilization, let's take a long-term approach so that we start laying groundwork for remote being a core part of our operational strategy and our actual talent strategy. So I would say either way, you've got to figure out the here and now. You might as well do it in a way that benefits you long-term. So the first element here is to establish a remote leadership team. So there's a lot of nuances to remote, and it doesn't neatly fit entirely into, let's say, a chief people officer role or a chief operations officer role, or even a chief IT or business operations role. There's some changes that you'll need to make from a tooling perspective, some changes that you'll need to make from an access perspective, definitely changes from a people and culture perspective. And it really requires all of these functions to come together and have a unified front on here's how we're going to adapt to this. Here's how we're going to empower our team to acclimate to this. And so I would say if you don't already have one, I mean, I'm head of remote at GitLab, and I honestly think that in 5 years, this will be a very common title because of what you're seeing right now. But in the interim, it's sort of a nexus between people operations and IT. And I think those leaders need to get together. And one of the first things they should do is create a feedback mechanism for everyone on their team that is now suddenly remote, because they're all going to have different things that break. They're going to all have different challenges. And if you provide a feedback mechanism from them, you'll start to quickly see some trends. And I think the trend lines that you see will prioritize what you need to fix first and second, and so on. The second thing is establishing a handbook, and this kind of segues from the feedback mechanisms. You say, where do we provide a feedback mechanism? Where do people provide feedback? GitLab's handbook, if you printed it out, would be over 5,000 pages. It's all open source. We don't have an internal handbook and an external handbook. Everything is external to the world. I recognize that not every company will be that comfortable with that level of transparency, but GitLab Pages is a great place to start a handbook. If you want to start smaller, Notion is a good place, as well as a company called Ask Almanac. They're relatively new, but they've crowdsourced a lot of guides that they will let you use as a starter template, and then you can kind of iterate on it and build for your company. That way you don't have to start completely from scratch as a blank page. That said, GitLab's handbook did begin as one page. So establishing it now and getting it going is really important. People often ask me, well, how does a handbook start? What is the first thing I should write down? I think it's two things. One, you should write down your culture, document your values, document your culture. In a lot of co-located spaces, culture is just the energy or the vibe that you get in the building, but that's really dangerous in a remote setting because no one's in the same building. And so culture can only be what you write down. And what you write down is how you go about your business, what values dictate how you make a business decision. And they also dictate how you treat each other within the company, which is really, really important when you can't see each other. The next thing is to establish a communications plan. And this may feel a little awkward. Structuring communication may feel like micromanagement. But here's the thing, if you don't tell a remote team where business communication happens and where informal communication happens, and you just sort of assume that those things will work themselves out, they might not. And this generally leads to the isolation and loneliness that you oftentimes hear cited as a big issue with remote work. In many cases, people feel isolated because their people group or their leadership team, they do not take the proactive effort to establish communication channels where people can just talk about life. So an example that GitLab does is we actually expire our Slack messages after 90 days. And the reason we do that is twofold. One, we don't want work to happen in Slack. We want all of our work to happen in a GitLab merge request or a GitLab issue so that it's universally accessible and it's transparent to the entire company. The problem with doing work in Slack is that even in a public channel, sometimes the communication can get fractured. And then if it breaks off into a direct message, now you have silos of communication. And it's very, very quickly, you can create a situation where individual teams don't know what's going on across the organization. And then you get a lot of dysfunction and chaos. So you want to do whatever you can from a structural communication standpoint to avoid that. So for GitLab, by expiring those messages, it triggers this thought in our head that, I don't want to start this project or this idea in Slack because after 90 days, I won't even be able to search for it and see the archive of my train of thought. So I'm going to start it over here in a GitLab issue where everyone can see it. So I call that a forcing function. And I've linked one of our guides on forcing functions in the Google Doc within Zoom. And for those listening on YouTube, if you Google remote first forcing functions, GitLab, you will see that as one of our guides. In addition to that, the second part of why we do that within Slack is it makes Slack an amazing informal communication tool. So if we don't use it for work, what do we use it for? we create a lot of topical channels, and this is the responsibility of our people group, something that I alluded to earlier. So we think about, what do people want to talk about? Maybe it's hiking, maybe it's mental health, maybe it's music, maybe it's fitness. We have a parenting channel that has been quite popular of late, now that many of our employees around the world have kids at home. So now they're kind of double timing as a homeschool teacher. And so this parenting channel is there for parents to just join together as humans and as parents and connect on what apps they're using, what educational programs they're looking into, what tips they have for keeping their kids sane and injury-free. It's a very free-flowing conversation, and we're able to bond and connect with people in a very real and meaningful way. And it happens pretty naturally, but you have to take that first step of creating that channel and giving people permission to talk about things like that. If you don't, and you use it explicitly for work, people will tend to feel isolated and will be overrun by work, and they won't have enough opportunity to actually connect as humans. The next thing is minimizing the tool stack. Now, this one can be a bit controversial because for some teams, if you're going remote and you don't have the right tools in place, you actually do need to implement new tooling just to enable and empower your team. But if you're coming from a place where you already have some amount of digital connectivity, I would say to introduce as little new chaos as you possibly can. And a new tool on top of being in a new work environment can create a lot of unnecessary chaos. So the core four that GitLab uses is Zoom, Slack, GitLab, the product for merge requests and issues, and G Suite. And I oftentimes get asked, why do we use Zoom if you have Google Hangouts or Slack video? And the truth is, the enterprise scale in Zoom is unmatched. We oftentimes have over 600 people on a Zoom call. It's something that we need at our scale, and it always works without a hitch. And so that is very useful for us. But I would say if you have a smaller team, you could potentially even minimize this further and just use the video features within G Suite or Slack or something like that. The overall point here is take a look at what tools you have, and instead of immediately jumping to introduce a new one, see if you can use what you currently have in a different way. Quick note on that, for G Suite, for example, a lot of people are familiar with Google Docs, and you may use them ad hoc for meeting notes or just a scratch pad. But GitLab took G Suite and said, what if we took Google Docs and we appended it to every single meeting invite so that every meeting would have an agenda, so that every meeting would have a purpose, there would be a documented flow such that people that came into the meeting late or couldn't join the meeting for whatever reason would still have some sort of documented trail on what actually happened. So we didn't actually have to buy a new tool for that. We just used Google Docs in a way that isn't conventionally thought to be used. So I would say encourage your leadership team to think about that. What tools do we have that maybe aren't being utilized to their full extent? And the last big thing I want to talk about is driving change. Being forced into a remote environment, it's a lot of change. It's jarring. And I want to point out that it's not about going from the office to remote. If you took all of GitLab's employees, which are all remote, and overnight you forced us into an office, it would also be very jarring for us. It would be very upsetting to our workflows. Our workspaces would look very different. Maybe our connectivity would have issues. Maybe the key fobs for the elevator wouldn't quite work right. It would be very disjointed for us as well. And so I just want to point out that yes, going to work from home creates some change, but also what you really need to be thinking about is this is a structural change in people's lives. And as a leadership team, you need to ask, what can we do to help people ease into this, to acclimate? Even people, I've seen examples where if you live in a small one-bedroom apartment and you don't have a dedicated space to carve out, leadership can be more lenient when it comes to expenses and allowing people to expense things like noise canceling headphones or a more ergonomic desk setup, something to make them feel more comfortable in that new space. I've linked a few of these in the Google Doc, but the point here is that there's a lot of great information within the GitLab handbook. We have links and guides on how we do everything related to remote, how we think about asynchronous workflows, how we think about documentation, even how we hire and interview and compensate people in a remote space. We're also working on a few more guides, things like collaboration. We oftentimes get, how do I collaborate with my designers remotely? And we're also doing a dedicated deep dive on onboarding, on how we actually onboard people when there's no office to usher them into. So allremote.info is the takeaway link here. We're building and standing up new guides all the time. Join the All Remote Conversation on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter. So if you have any additional questions after this, please feel free to reach out to me, mention that you were in this meetup, and I would be happy to help. And so with that, I would love to open it up for Q&A. And Lior, unless you disagree, I guess we can go straight to the document unless there's anything else that you wanted to add there.
No, I think we don't have any question from the YouTube streaming, right, Anat?
No questions here, so we can finish the broadcast now. And
there is a question, I see.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
So several questions from the broadcast, and then we'll go to the private discussion. So go ahead, Anna.
Okay, so I'm going to read the first question. In what cases, features, they thought to change GitLab abilities in order to better work for their remote use cases? So, not sure I understand that question.
I'll take a swing at it. So,
Okay.
GitLab is a tool that's built by a remote team. And because of that, it has to work for remote teams. And so the beautiful thing about using GitLab as a remote team is that you know that it's being worked on and iterated on, and features are being built by a remote team. So we use it in a remote setting. We have no offices, therefore it must work well for remote teams. And I just want to explain one thing that's really unique about GitLab, and I think it's been more present now more than ever, is that we use GitLab across the company for everything we do, even in non-dev roles. So even our finance team and our marketing team, we run all of our events and projects, project management within GitLab. And we're actually actively working on making some of the interfaces a little bit more friendly for those that aren't steeped in the developer community, because we recognize that that's a need. We need to lower the bar to where somebody can jump into GitLab and just understand how to collaborate, because it is a phenomenal collaboration tool in an asynchronous environment. And what I mean by that is, commonly you'll see an instance where someone will try to get enough people in a boardroom in a synchronous meeting to talk about something really big, like the FY21 marketing budget, like this really big thought that they just want to get people in a room for an hour and just sort of see what happens. And the GitLab way to do that is we have the leader of that marketing team write down initial thoughts and initial scope and put it out there in an issue. And then now that that issue is public within the company, you can just link that issue in the Slack marketing channel and say, hey, I'm opening this up for discussion and feedback for the next week. Here's the link. Everyone here, please feel free to jump in, quote what you're responding to. And then after a week, you'll have this amazing documented trail of all of the thought. It's very precise, it's very detailed, all of the feedback that went into this plan. And then you could have a deciding meeting after that to take all of that feedback into account. And this is a real life example. This actually happened earlier this month. And the amount of detail and precision that you get, it's so much more rich than if you just forced the people you could find in a common space into an hour-long meeting and get what you get. And so I don't know if that's 100% what you're after, but it did prompt me to explain kind of how we use GitLab and how we think about that, and also how we try to work more asynchronously. And this helps us battle the time zone issue, which is very real. And in some cases, you do need to make compromises to be on the phone at the same time or a video call at the same time. But we don't default to meetings. We default to asynchronous, and we try to push that as far as we possibly can, because it's more inclusive to people, it's more respectful of their time, and it also enables people to give deeper, more thoughtful feedback instead of just whatever comes to mind in a synchronous meeting.
Let's pick another question and move to the private discussion.
Yeah, we're going to answer one more question from the YouTube channel, and then later on we'll post Darren's answers on text. Is that okay with you, Darren?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Great. So next question is, I would love to hear how GitLab finds candidates and how interviews are done.
Yes, great question. So on YouTube, in the Google Doc here, I have a link to this, but for those watching on YouTube, if you Google GitLab interview, you'll find a handbook page that lays out our entire interview process. We're very transparent about how it happens, and it's open source. So you're welcome to copy and paste it and use it in your company as well. You could also Google GitLab remote hiring. I stood up an all remote hiring page of how companies in general can think about hiring and compensating in a remote environment. So I think if you pair those two, you'll have a pretty good idea and approach to it. But every GitLab hire is purely done on Zoom calls. We never have to meet face to face. We are very intentional about hiring managers of one. If you look at our GitLab's values page, you look at a lot of the sub values, there's a sub value there on being a manager of one. So I would encourage you to read that. And that's essentially what we screen for and what we hire for. We look for people that appreciate autonomy. They appreciate the empowerment that comes with it. And we ask people, give us examples of how you've worked remotely before and in the past. And the interesting thing about that question, sometimes you have to dig a little deeper because somebody might say, well, I've only worked in an office for 20 years. I've never actually worked remotely. But then you could say something like, well, did you ever move a project forward while flying on a plane? Did you ever move a project forward while you were at a conference away from the office? Or even if you're coming out of university, did you ever move a project forward with classmates while they were on campus and you were off campus? The truth is, in 2020, most people have worked remotely in some form or fashion, even if it doesn't immediately dawn on them that that was remote. You just have to dig a little bit deeper to get some stories on how did you operate in a remote setting? How did it feel to have to communicate when you weren't sitting directly in front of someone? So I would say there are stories to be had, and we ask for things like that, and we interview for things like that. And the last thing I'll add there is if you Google what's it like to work at GitLab, there is a subsection within our jobs FAQ that I actually stood up. I think it's 3 paragraphs and 4 links. And I think if you read all of that, you have a very clear understanding of what it would be like to work here. And the point there is, if you're a company and you're hiring remotely, and even if you're not, but especially if you're hiring remotely, you should make sure that your vision, your strategy, and an FAQ on what is it like to work here is all public. You need to force yourself to actually answer that question. What is it like to work here? What do we want to convey to potential job seekers about what we offer them as a company? And sometimes that can be hard. Sometimes that acts as a forcing function of things you need to change, because as you're writing it out and being honest with yourself, you're like, we actually need to offer something different to candidates. So I would say that discipline is actually really good. But the other thing that does is it cleans up your recruiting pipeline. People don't accidentally end up at GitLab. You can read that in advance. You can read our vision, our roadmap, our strategy, all of that in advance. It does us no good to hold that back, get someone in, and then say, oh, by the way, here's the culture. By the way, here's the strategy. Hope you're aligned with that. We want to make sure all of that is out there before they ever apply so that they opt into what we're building here, because we want to be respectful of their time. And if they're not going to thrive here, we want them to know that as early in advance as possible. And conversely, if this is the perfect place for them, we would love for them to apply and come here versus go somewhere else. So if you don't have that stood up, it's a pretty easy exercise. It doesn't have to be very long. I would say look at ours. What's it like to work at GitLab? It's in the jobs FAQ. So take a look at that, and maybe that could be a model for you as
well. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Darren. We're going to stop the live broadcast right now and going to move on to the private Q&A session. You can keep on asking questions on YouTube, and Darren will answer them later happily. So bye everyone, and see you again next time.